Game loaded.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of Lessons Learned with your host, Rafael Piñero. Welcome to Lessons Learned podcast with Gludipow and myself.
Hello, everybody.
We're going to be talking about Mass Effect, and the reason why we're going to be talking about Mass Effect is that both of us are huge fans of the game, and also because we have some interesting things that we think we can extract from the game and make it a conversation. And in fact, the idea for this conversation comes from Gludipow. So Gludi, could you tell us what we're going to be talking about?
Well, today we are going to be talking about racism found in Mass Effect. It's a huge topic in Mass Effect, actually, as a sci-fi game. And we're also going to be talking, if we can fit it in, a little bit about the recent news that's been going on in terms of what's been going on with BioWare. So, yeah.
Right off the gate, big issues, right for the fandom. So let's talk about racism, ethnocentrism, and speciesism, if that's the way you say it. It's
Xenophobia.
Xenophobia, yeah. This is not the first game that introduces this subject in BioWare. You saw it also in Dragon Age. You've seen it in KOTOR and other games. But it's very interesting the way Mass Effect does it. It follows a long-term pattern of using different species and the conflicts between species to talk about things like racism, or at least introduce the subject.
Right.
And I'm going to bring Adam Coble into the discussion. He's a game designer, a tabletop RPG game designer, player, and Twitch streamer. And he talked about the idea that the reason you use other species, alien species, is that it creates a space between the actual subject and the game itself, or the fictional aspect of it. A space that allows people to be comfortable enough to engage with the subject without feeling threatened or directly involved.
Right. Okay.
But the problem is that that space also means that it tends to have no real correlation with the actual subject. It's very easy to dismiss the real life connections because it's fictional, and of course these alien races don't exist, and it doesn't really seem to fit real life.
Yeah, I can see where he's coming from that, but I feel like things that have those connections to real life, like things that we see in real life, such as ethnocentrism and racism and problems like that, we can relate to it. So it makes it because it's so relatable. It makes it a lot more popular. Like you see these things like with Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings and things, and they have real life related struggles that we as people in the real world can relate to, but it happens in a fantasy world, a world that we actually would like to be, would like to be a part of. Because, it's a completely different world. It's foreign to us. It's different. It's unique, but it still has those relatable problems. So, it appeals to a large audience because of that.
Also as writers, we get to explore these issues and sort of add our own thoughts to them because we're able to control all these factors, right? We can world build around species and planets and galaxies and kingdoms. Right. And that allows us to sort of move the pieces around a little bit and try, if that's what our goal is, to show a different light or inject even our own opinions on the subject, which is also part of the process.
Well, right. Well, in writing, when you do world building, you always got to have like a world that, is its own, is completely different or similar to the real world without actually being the real world if we're talking in a fantasy or sci-fi sense. And it has to have its own people of particularly different races or species that speak their own language. I mean, Mass Effect didn't really do that, but I believe they talked about having translators anyway in Mass Effect 2. And, having their own cultures, traditions, things of that nature. And that's what you do when you world build as a writer. And that's how you flesh out a world that's relatable and real to both the reader and the writer itself. The writer has to feel that in their head, this world is real, because then for your reader, it will seem real as well.
Yeah, it's all part of the suspension of disbelief. Now, let's unpack a little bit the terms of ethnocentrism and racism. Because ethnocentrism works in sort of a tribal formula, right? It's individuals relating to other individuals within a given group. And it can be ethnicity, it can be race, it can be religion, it can be anything that unifies a group and sets a common set of standards for behavior and attitudes and separates them from other groups. That's very clear in Mass Effect. The fact that we have other species and they have different biologies and they have certain cultural aspects to them. The Turians are very militaristic. The Krogans are the warrior types. And on and on and on. The Volos are the merchants. You have very clear ethnocentric markers, which again is very common in sci-fi, as a shorthand also to analyze different aspects of humanity as well. But the term about racism is not simply a matter of saying, oh, I don't like this person, or uttering racial slurs. Racism, at least modern racism, has always existed because, ethnocentrism and racism are linked, is a construct that essentially was used and reinforced, even to this day, to allow Western European powers to conquer the rest of the world. In other words, how do you justify taking someone else's land? Well, they don't speak our own language, they don't believe in our own religion, and oh, by the way, they're less than human.
Right, demonizing them more or less.
Exactly. And either you justify them by bringing the light of civilization, being your own ethnic group set and beliefs, or by dismissing them and, destroying them, or a combination of the two, which is what we've seen in the last 500 to 600 years. Again, not unique to Western Europe, but the particular flavor of modern racism comes from that. And then people want to say, well, what about Africa and the African slave, or the Muslim slaves or the triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and America also had an African side to it. Yeah, these things are complex, but they are born, at least in the modern sense, last 500 years, from a need of European powers to become global powers. And in that sense, at first, it seems that Mass Effect doesn't touch those subjects. But when you look at certain races, such as the Vorcha, the Krogan, the Protheans, especially in the third game, not so much in the first game, and the Quarians, you start seeing, and even with the Volas as well, you start seeing the attitudes and language that reflects racism, even though it's done under the, the rubric of different species, right? Making that analogy between different species and different cultures on Earth, historically speaking.
Right. The definition of racism, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race, racial prejudice or discrimination. With examples being racialism and xenophobia. Ethnocentrism is evaluation of other cultures according to preconceptions originating in the standards and customs of one's own culture. In other words, believing that your ethnicity or culture is the only good one. An example of ethnocentrism was the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. Some people may have called them racist, but by definition, they were actually ethnocentric. And the reason why they can be defined as ethnocentric is because they did not feel that they as themselves, their race was superior. They felt that their culture was superior, that their religion, their traditions, all of that was superior. And that's why they would go out and try to conquer people like Rome did.
Yeah, very much so that, that in ancient times, you would not make a distinction between, say, a North African Roman and a mainland or an Iberian Roman citizen or someone from Rome.
Right.
Other based on, say, perhaps wealth. But barbarians, you could enslave Germanic barbarians, Celtic barbarians, African barbarians, Arabian barbarians, Jews, etc. You could enslave them. Although, of course, later on, there were some differences in religion and stuff like that would justify certain purges and attacks. But for the most part, very much ethnocentric as opposed to racist.
Right. Yeah, because like in ancient, like pre-Christian times, I'm not going to say racism didn't exist, but in in the dictionary definition sense of the word, cultures like Rome and Greece and basically dominating cultures that went out and conquered other nations like the Vikings and such, felt that their cultures were superior to these ones that they were conquering versus feeling that they as a race were superior.
Also, I think we have to see that both of these attitudes reinforce each other, right? That they're linked. They're not the same. It's a good idea to have both definitions so we can know where we're talking about, but they do reinforce each other. If you believe that your tribe, your group is better than others, it's much easier to believe that others are inferior based on things like inherent physical features, and et cetera, right? So racial attitudes tend to reinforce ethnocentric attitudes, and ethnocentric characters can seed racist attitudes and vice versa.
Right.
Now, talking about the sort of systemic racism, because it's very easy to talk about slurs and for example, have Ashley Williams say, I can't tell the difference between the animals and the people, right? Which is clearly a very, both.
You mean the animals and the aliens?
Yeah, it's meant both of them, but also reflects a sort of both ignorance, but a certain hostility as well, right?
Right.
And that's very easy. Oh, look, she said that. Or a young Gareth Vakarian have an attitude that, or Kaden Lenko talking about the Krogan, right? Oh, I didn't know the Krogan were, all savages, right? You can say that, for example, in the form of Gareth, the fact that he is a police officer and always sees the worst of any species, will give him the tendency to believe the worst and believe the stereotypes, right?
Right.
The police officer who stops the Quarian in Pilgrimage in the second game. And it's like, how these Quarians are, right? Those are very superficial things and very easy to point at them. It's like, look, there's an ethnocentric or racist conflict here. Example, clear, no problem. But again, we're talking about a bigger issue, patterns here. And when you look at certain species and within the, the history of the universe, for example, the way the Vorch are treated as a species, right? They're seen as vermin by a lot of other species.
Oh yeah, they're universally disliked, and I think part of that might be because, well, one, they breed out of control, and two, they seem to have a high gang affiliation, what with a lot of them being a part of the Blood Pack.
Yeah, but again, being exploited by the Blood Pack. And I mean, again, these are attitudes like, yes, they seem to breed very fast, but so do Salarians. Salarians are in charge, and we see by the Dalatras when she talks about the Krogan. So nobody goes to the Salarian and goes, hey, you guys breed pretty fast. Oh, no, but we're dominant species, and we have a certain controls over that. You, on the other hand, the Krogan, and it's very telling, the Krogan are not the Krogan Wars. They're the Krogan Rebellions. The fact that if you rebel, that implies that you were in a subordinate position.
Right. Well, technically, if you think about it, they were, because they were uplifted by the Solarians and basically put into servitude for a war against the Rachni.
And then apparently never given the choice to become a full member of the council.
Right. They were seen as too violent, and then they were...
But those are the attitudes displayed by the dominant species. And that's the thing about, again, racism. You also bring imperialism as well into the mix. It gets complicated. The way the Salarians work is that they tend to work using proxies. They used the Krogan. When you go to the STG base, they seem to be trying to use Varen and other species to fight the wars for them, to uplift them, in spite of the usual, caveats like that's not a good idea. It's going to backfire on you. Manipulating other species to do their bidding. The Krogan themselves, at least the Blood Pack, seems to be using the Vorcha for the same purpose. In the case of the Quarians, it's kind of difficult to tell there. You have a lot of ethnocentric attitudes, negative attitudes, so the Quarians, but the Quarians are never seen as inherently inferior, at least technologically or perhaps socially. So it's a mixed bag.
I believe that there is like a little bit of, I don't know if I would say ethnocentrism or racism, because it's kind of hard to clarify between the two when it comes to the Quarians. But basically with the Quarians, we see a lot of hostility. I think there's a lot of distrust there, which if you think about it, the Quarians are kind of like the Mass Effect version of gypsies. Like if anybody has seen...
Romani is supposed to be the more accurate term. Gypsies are seen to be a bit of a slur.
well, I apologize, but
I'm not Romani, of course, so I'm not talking for them. But yeah, somebody might probably point it out with good reason, because again, that term also comes loaded with a lot of baggage with it.
right. But you understand what I'm talking about
Hmm.
is uh if anybody has ever seen The Hunchback of Notre Dame, you had the people that were called gypsies in that movie, and they were nomadic. They were a very nice community, but they were treated with a lot of mistrust and considered thieves and things of that nature, even though, they were dancing and performing for their coin. Quarians are kind of very similar to that in the fact that, they'll do technology and things like that for money, or they'll try and go out for their pilgrimage to help their flotilla. But people are constantly treating them with distrust and things like that because, they're an unknown. They're assumed to be thieves because they don't know what lengths they're gonna go to in order to achieve that ability to return to their flotilla with technology to help them. So, there's that huge sense of mistrust there, as we saw with the Quarian and the Volus, and I believe it was Mass Effect 2.
Yeah, but I think especially when you have the Volus thrown in the mix, the issue with the Quarians is more economic, right? They are the people who live in the margins, right? They
Hmm.
are the people who live in the margins. They're entertainers. They're people who are tinkers. That's a term from the Middle Ages, often associated with the Romani, or the Roma. Um, and not to be confused with Romanians, by the way. And it's the economic aspect of seeing people who are poorer than you and to be inferior to you by virtue of their poverty, right?
Hmm.
That they deserve their lot because, they're poor. If they weren't poor, they would be rich and would be good people. They're assigning good or bad traits, assigning value to people based on their economic condition. And of course, it gets complicated with the whole issue of the AI rebellion by the Geth, right? That is something that they brought on themselves, maybe, right? Well, not maybe. Actually, that's something they brought on themselves. Although we do learn that a lot of Quarians were not in favor of, exterminating the Geth, which
Right.
makes the issue even more complicated. We talk about the Krogan, of course, how they're treated. Very interesting also how the Dalatras and even characters that are supposed to be sympathetic to the Krogan, like Morden, kind of view the Krogan in a paternalistic kind of way, right? Like it's sort of the white man's burden version of Mass Effect. That is the burden of the more civilized people to treat the not so civilized in certain ways. And when they didn't conform, then of course they were sterilized, which was not actual genocide, but it is mentioned in the game. It's called social or cultural genocide. How accurate is that is, but it shows that sort of that imbalance of power. Yes, the Krogan are physically strong and military capable, but when it comes to the political power of the galaxy, they clearly are still second rate.
Hmm.
And it sort of brings back the whole imperial aspect of this as well.
Well, I would think like in terms of the Krogans, I kind of always viewed their culture as kind of like Spartanish in nature, only because if you think about it, a lot of their traditions are focused on creating the strongest warriors, the strongest members of their society, because you have they have the rite, which is what Grunt had to go through. Then you had the initiation that Bakara had to go through. And you have so many of these cultural traditions that put them in near-death situations or put their lives in danger. And basically, if you fail, then you weren't worth it anyway. And if you survive, then you're strong and you're worth it. Which is, not unknown to us as a human society, because many societies, including the Spartans, did that. They got rid of infants that were sick or deformed in any sense of the word, and they left those children to die. And when they came of age, they would send those kids into the wilderness to survive for, I think it was either a few weeks to a month. And those kids had to come back alive. And that's how and then they would go through warrior training and things of that nature. And that's basically how they build their society. So it's not an unknown to us as humans to have warrior societies like that where they strive for the strongest and the weak are left to perish.
They're very much a warrior tribal society, although there are hints in Mass Effect 3 that what we're seeing really is a post-apocalyptic society. And there are hints here and there in the Codex and other places, actually with the Blood Rage. that perhaps the Krogan were not always that way. Yes, Tuchanka is described as a death world, like a very tough world to live in. And the Krogan evolved to be the toughest, right?
Right.
But there are hints that perhaps the Krogan did achieve a level of civilization, a remarkable level of civilization by their own standards, as well as galactic standards. But that the modern Krogan are shaped by, a series of disasters, including nuclear war, the rebellions, and the genophage.
Right, but I think the thing that we have to remember, like, yes, the world when we see it in Mass Effect 2 and 3 is a post-nuclear war type world, because I believe it was mentioned by Bakara that they went to war with each other, and that's how their world became as it is. But I believe, if I remember correctly, that in Mass Effect 2, when they went to take Grunt to his right, that they talked about how the keystone that he was using had survived many wars and been survived through the ages, and they said it was just like the Krogan that had survived for so long. So it's probably not unreasonable to think that this rite is a tradition that has survived through the ages. It might have just become more brutal. But that's a theory or an assumption. But it's not unknown to believe that they originated as a warrior society like that, because if you recall, they actually had ruins for arenas and things like that, especially for the Thresher Maw arena and things of that nature.
Yeah, it's very much possible. But then again, making comparisons to human culture and even other cultures in the Mass Effect universe, that's not exactly unheard of, right? Having a warrior tradition, having a soldier tradition is not unheard of,
or a blood sport.
Or a blood sport. In fact, I think I think in the wiki they talk about the Krogan really gravitating to American football as something they like. That's corporate incorporating different traditions from different cultures as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one character that I find fascinating in the whole discussion about race, ethnicity, and imperialism and imposition of systems is Javik. Because Javik is an interesting guy. So not only he represents sort of the very clear-cut sort of 19th century, even early 20th century thinking about empire and, social Darwinism and all these things, but he has the voice of a West African man.
I always thought that his accent sounded rather Jamaican.
Well, it sounded a little more West African to me. I've known a couple of Jamaicans over the years and even visited the lovely island. And perhaps, after all, a lot of West Africans ended up in the Caribbean. And if you go not only to Jamaica, but you go to the Windward Isles, the English speakers tend to have similar accents, although the irony is a lot of those accents are heavily influenced by Scots and Irish immigrants as well. So it's a curious blend. And if we talk about Scots and Irish, how they relate to the English and their struggles also have, brings back all these similarities about control and power and empire and also economic deficiencies, not simply based on race, but also ethnicity and religion, etc. And therefore ethnocentrism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Javik is a pretty good example of ethnocentrism in the game, because he doesn't demonstrate racism. He demonstrates ethnocentrism, and the reason why we can believe that is because they didn't believe that, that their race was superior. They felt that their culture was superior, which is why they had all these other races join their culture and call themselves Prothean. Not because that they saw themselves racially superior, but because they saw their culture, their empire, as superior.
True. Also as a necessity as well. There was a sort of self-justifying cycle of imperial construction. They needed to build an empire because they feared the threat of machines, and the machines came, so they needed more strength for the empire, etc., etc. It's also a sort of social Darwinistic edge to it as well. Again, like the Krogan, it seems to be all about strength.
Right.
If you're strong, you rule. If you're weak, you're ruled or destroyed.
Right.
And ultimately, it seems almost under that thinking, a condemnation of the Protheans as a whole species, because they were destroyed by the Reapers. Right, the Reapers proved to be the strongest and therefore deserved to rule and conquer. The Protheans did not. which is ironic because the whole thing with Javik is that he's fighting to the bitter end against the Reapers.
Mm-hmm.
So he has an attitude that in many ways justifies the Reaper's existence and yet still fights against them. So he plays the role of both conqueror and conquered. And then giving this particular voice makes for a very interesting commentary, perhaps on us as players in the real world, right? That this is a human condition. Given a chance, perhaps all of us would seek to rule. And that racism and ethnocentrism are just tools for that. I don't know how true that is. I don't feel that it were true for me, but then again, I've never given a chance to rule an entire planet or a galaxy, so who knows?
Well, the unfortunate thing is, and I'm not trying to justify anything when I say this, is humans are herd animals. We always have been. You have a group of people to make one decision, and you're going to have somebody who initially was going to make the other decision suddenly decide to go with what the group did, because that's the herd mentality. So, because of that, we have this thing that's ingrained to where we don't trust anything that looks different from what we perceive as our herd. And, I'm not saying it's okay. It's not okay by any means. It's something that we as a society really need to look past and, just see ourselves as humans instead of whites and blacks and Hispanics and things of that nature. We just, need to overcome that. And I feel like, Mass Effect as a whole kind of touches on that in a sense because, you have all these species that have all these other people that look entirely different from them, and you have different species that have, like, going into the first game, have all these distrusts. Like, you got the Turians and the Krogans and the Solarians who don't trust each other. You got the Quarians and the Geth who don't trust each other. And then you got this bitter tension between the Turians and the humans since it's just shortly after the Contact War. So, you got all of these tensions and distrusts and things of that nature. And I think we as a society can really understand that because, we have that more subtly in human society, but, it's more emphasized in Mass Effect. You know what I mean? And then by the third game, all of these cultures and all of these races have come together and are coming to understandings and even building friendships to face a single enemy that threatens them. I mean, it's kind of messed up that they have to come together under these circumstances, but if anything positive, if any silver lining can be taken from the Reapers invading, it is that these cultures came together and eventually saw eye to eye.
Yeah, but that again is another common trope of the common enemy, right? That disparate societies can come together, at least under pressure, when they're both facing a powerful threat, a unifying powerful threat. I also think that the message, and this seems to be something that Shepard specifically sort of hammers, especially a Paragon Shepard in Mass Effect 3, is that the collective strength of the galaxy comes from their differences. Like the different species, and even I think Rex says something like that when you ask them why preserve the weaker clans. It says, well, because they have their own unique songs. They have their unique traditions. If we just simply assimilate them, they're going to disappear. We, in order to make the whole strong, we have to accept each other's similarities, right? Points of similarity, but also our differences. Even if that difference is, and I think it also brings another issue here, which is diversity within the Mass Effect universe and in media in general, that even if the other person's worldview is 1% off from yours, that can bring, open a window to new experiences and open your mind to the possibility that maybe you don't understand everything and you probably will never see the world as they do, but you understand that there is in fact a bigger world, or in the case of Mass Effect, a bigger galaxy.
Right.
And mechanically as well, I mean, the game sort of emphasizes that with the different species, right? Each species has different mechanics in terms of biotics or tech abilities or soldier abilities. If you want to succeed in the game, you have to bring a balanced party to most encounters. Not just simply about building your main character up with, weapons and skills. It's about building up the party. It's one of those situations where the story and the mechanics really gel in, even if it's, something that we've seen before.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I feel like in terms of like the characters in Mass Effect that demonstrate racism, I feel like Ashley gets the brunt of it only because her racism is kind of, how do I put it? It comes across as the most hostile. But we do have examples of other members of our group being even remotely racist, or at least ethnocentric. I mean, Javik is one, obviously, but he doesn't get as much hate as Ashley does for the ethnocentrism or xenophilia. You got Grunt, who actually said that he hated Turians at one point. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's racist per chance, but it does come across that way for sure. And then you got Garrus, who in the very beginning had a very big distrust of Krogans. I mean, his evolving friendship with Rex eventually changed that, but he still had that short-sightedness.
Well, yeah, we can go down the list. I think Shepard, being the player character, gets mostly a pass unless you play a renegade, in which case sort of the human-centric, ethnocentric part of that of the character comes in.
Mm-hmm.
But as a Paragon, you see someone who tries to be very inclusive. In fact, one could argue that's the main difference between being a renegade and a Paragon. It's not so much good and evil, per se. No, it was never meant to be that way. But that Paragon is more diplomatic and more open to the ideas of others, including other
A lot
people.
more open-minded, yeah.
And Renegade is very much ethnocentric, human-centric. It's like, I'm a human special forces alliance Marine. I'm here to defend humanity. You can step up or you can step off, right?
Right, pretty much.
Going down the line. For example, we have Caden, and he gets the same line as Garrus. If you're doing those infamous elevator sequences, which I actually liked because there are times to actually learn about the other characters, although, they could be very repetitive, and I think that's why people hated them. Also, I think, especially Americans, feel that they feel uncomfortable in elevators, right? So that too, I think, influenced those sequences. But he has a line where he basically says, essentially, that Rex is a credit to his race, right? Oh, you're not like the other Krogan. And basically Rex says, you know what? How about you don't say that, because you're assuming that every other race out there is ethnically and socially diverse, but all the Krogans are supposed to be monsters and gangsters. So why do you keep your opinions to yourself? And he says a similar, Garrus says the same thing, and he responds in a very similar way to Garrus. So even Caden, who comes off as being someone who says, oh, everybody's human. In other words, other species have their own problems, but in the end of the day, those problems are very similar to the way humans act. You have good people and bad people in every race. Still makes that kind of comment.
Yeah, still makes that stereotype.
Yeah, Garrus, I think, again, because he was CSEC and also comes from from a military point of view, and that essentially is a mindset that points to an idea of seeing threats. Right, and seeing the worst of other people.
Well, and if you take into consideration that Turians are kind of taught at a very young age that Krogan are not like them, that they're not quote unquote civilized, so they're probably given that lesson at a very young age, because it's kind of a thing that is most likely taught, that that this race is like this, so you shouldn't trust them.
Yeah, that's true. We have, of course, Tally and the Geth. Although, of course, the fact that they went to war and nearly wiped out each other, brings that. But you really have in Tally, sort of this visceral. She's willing to defend her people, and she often is at the butt of other people's jokes and comments, ethnocentric and even racist comments. But even though I keep using those terms as they were interchangeable, even though we define them as not. That when it comes to the Geth, she displays the same attitude, right? And at least in the first game, and that's the thing that sort of changed over the games, in the first game, we're supposed to agree with her. Shepard has the chance to tell her, no, you tried to kill them. And in fact, again, talking about imperialism, in this sense, you were creating a slave race. So the moment the slaves realized they were slaves, they probably wouldn't want to be slaves. So it wasn't in fact that they were machines, but rather that you were compelling, and actually Tally says so. It's like, the menial tasks by which the Geth were designed would not satisfy a sapient or sentient creature.
Right.
Right? And yet even though she understands that, she still has this loathing for them, right?
Right.
Rex, I think, is the one that has the least aspects of that. But more so because being the at the receiving end of all of it, also he's the oldest. He's at least 1,000 years old. So he's seen the best and the worst of every single species, including his own. He's the harshest critic of his own species, right, and their own failings. However, he's also the biggest optimist when it comes to the Krogan. He sees all the negative trends, but he also hopes, and eventually, if he survives, spoiler for the games, he can actually move them in the right direction, hopefully in their own direction.
Right.
So there's that. Liara also has that. Liara has a sort of naive ethnocentrism, right?
Yeah, I was actually going to touch on that Liara does have like that undertone of ethnocentrism. Just like if you pay attention to how she talks about the Protheans, she admits in Mass Effect 3 that she might be coloring them with her own perception on Asari culture. But she does paint her the Protheans as she views them as other Asari, more or less, like, culturally and philosophically wise. And so there is, and I don't want to say it's just Liara. Like, there's a lot of Asari that seem to have that mentality or that undertone of feeling that Asari are more or less culturally superior to every other race in the galaxy.
Well, with some justification in this, at least from their ethnic-centric view, is that they're the first species that came to the Citadel. Essentially, they're the species that has helped set up the entire galactic structure. And it seems that the entire galactic structure serves them primarily, like all the laws, and they're the wealthiest on average. We really don't see a lot of poverty in the few Asari worlds that we connect. In fact, I don't see any Asari that has to be in poverty. We see some working Asari in the background, but we've seen humans in poverty. We've seen some Turians with less than sterling jobs. Certainly, of course, other species like Evorsha are sort of entire poor species, that sort of thing. But we often see Asari, at least working class Asari, or better.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems, they talk about it. There's a part where they talk about even in Asari culture, you will have to create special technologies to feed everyone and banish poverty. And clearly the poverty has to exist at some level, even in their home world. But they're the ones with the most experience. They're the ones who are, if there's a ruling class and a ruling race in the galaxy, the Asari are it. They live longer than almost any other race, except for the Krogan. And most Krogan don't live that long because they die to disease and or violence. So they are in a privileged position. They tend to have the most advanced technology as well. And of course, it turns out that technology came from the Protheans, directly from the Protheans.
Right.
And they were hiding it, right? And also Liara, they come from a position of privilege and power.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And Liara, being the daughter of two matriarchs, and there's a comment, for example, Televisir, who says, that her education was very expensive at Ceres University. So clearly Liara had the best of everything.
Right.
She may have walked away from her mother, etc. But even that separation, the way she describes it, was amicable.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least it was sort of one-sided. It was Liara rejecting what her mother represented, but her mother perfectly understanding that, that she was doing okay, that's what daughter's supposed to do. So it wasn't, it wasn't even, it was amicable, at least as such breakups can be. And when she speaks, especially in the first game, she speaks certainly from a point of privilege.
Right.
Talking about the Protheans is very interesting because when she actually sort of meets the closest thing to a Prothean in the first game, they're all scientists as well, right? It's on Ilos, it's a research facility, and the VI and recordings sound like knowledgeable people. They don't sound like warriors. You don't see signs of weapons in Ilos. It's supposed to be a research facility. Studying, the key technology of the Mass Effect universe, which are the mass relays, and not, the warrior that Java comes to be. And also, I wonder, and we don't have anybody from BioWare here to tell us about it, especially none of the writing team, the shift, because the voices in the original Mass Effect didn't sound like Javik, yet everybody in Mass Effect 3 sounded very similar to Javik, including the VIs. So I had to wonder why they made that change. It's an interesting one. I like it, but, I'm going to leave that question open whether or not we actually can know why they make that change.
Mm-hmm.
News about Mass Effect Andromeda. Ladies and gentlemen, the fandom is nervous because a few people have left the project in recent months, starting December with both the lead writer, director, and I don't know the title of the third person that left this month, or about a week ago. Now, before the program started, Gludipow and I were discussing whether this is in fact bad news for Andromeda, and considering all the other people that also left BioWare, is it bad news for BioWare? Now, personally, I understand the concern, but I think it's too early to tell. Although, of course, when, say, a studio all of a sudden is closes, it's like it catches everybody by surprise because nobody expected it. So there's that as well, in the way the industry works. So, Gludipow, what do you think about that?
Well, as somebody who's actually studying in college to get into the gaming industry, regarding the people that are leaving and stuff like I'm in groups and stuff like that, and on forms of social media where as soon as one of these articles comes out, it's posted to the group and everybody freaks out. There's it's like putting a fox in a hen house, I swear.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no reason to freak out as much as people have been. I can understand, it's the BioWare fandom. They're pretty negative to begin with, and jump to assumptions, and are overall rather skittish, because what if we don't get our game? But the majority of the people that have left, like out of the 6 people, 5 of them are writers. Their jobs are done and over with. The game has already been announced to have about an hour's worth of playability already. So their jobs have already been established. I mean, it's like having a movie in CGI development. Are you going to freak out if the script writers are like suddenly leave? No, because their job is done. It would be more concerning if a CGI designer were to suddenly leave. Like, that would be more concerning. The only one that out of those 5 that is even remotely concerning is Chris Wynn, because Chris Wynn was a development director, and his job is a little bit more in line with the current development, but because it's already being put into playability, his job might not be as important as, opposed to say a game designer. So you have that. And then, the whole delay thing, I know people are freaking out, like, oh, these people are leaving, and then the game was pushed back, and it's just boding ill. And I can understand why people who don't understand how the gaming industry works would probably jump to that conclusion. But games get pushed back all the time. Dragon Age was pushed back and delayed twice. And I think fans have forgotten that. The game was pushed back the first time because EA had put an unreasonable an unreasonable deadline on the game, which fans assumed meant that it was going to be a half-assed quality. So they told them, no, you're going to let them take their time so that this game is not a repeat of Dragon Age 2. After all of that fan pressure, EA relented and said, okay, fine, we'll let them work. So they did, and then in June of that year, it was announced that the game was going to be delayed again by a month. Instead of being released in October, it was going to be released in November. So it was pushed back not once, but twice. And so, with Mass Effect Andromeda being pushed back by just a couple months, because we have to remember, it was initially announced to be released in a holiday of this year. It's being pushed back by a maximum of about 3 months. That is, by consideration to what Dragon Age Inquisition was delayed, that is significantly lesser. That is significantly lesser than what Dragon Age Inquisition was delayed for.
I mean, yeah, for example, we also have the counterexample of Dragon Age 2, which came out a mere 18 months after the release of, I think, the last DLC for the original Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age Awakening, and the other DLC. And I know there's a lot of people who are in the BioWare fandom who actually like Dragon Age, and we may have to talk about that, although I started my YouTube channel basically lambasting and breaking down Dragon Age 2, so I spent quite a bit of saliva on that one, but we can still talk about it. But it shows, right? The repetitive environments, the sort of convoluted plot lines. It wasn't the best product that BioWare has put out there. And if you look at Inquisition, it is at the very least a much bigger game. More areas, more things to do, etc. A lot of people consider them to be busy work, but it shows that they put the time and effort to do so. It does have one minor problem, and that comes to the cost of making a game. Delays in releasing a game do add to the cost, especially the advertising budgets, because you have to keep putting news out there, keeping the hype train going, keeping the interest, leaking news, going to Twitter, putting out new trailers. If you had a release on 2016, that means your big news was going to come out in E3. And E3 is very expensive, and all the PAXs and stuff like that. Now you may have to move the shares a little bit and say, okay, maybe I don't talk about Andromeda in E3. In fact, EA, I think it's keeping E3 altogether. They're doing a pre-E3 show of their own, and some other companies are making the same move. Because again, these shows are very expensive. Those booths and those displays are not, just renting the space can cost you tens of thousands and not hundreds of thousands of dollars in major cities. Moving all the equipment, setting up all the shows, that's equivalent of a major pop star setting up a concert. And that stuff is expensive. And that goes right into the budget of the game, right? The budget of the game includes all the advertising. So the longer you have to keep the game out of stores, the more it's going to cost you.
Right.
Now, is it going to bankrupt the game? I don't think so.
Mm-mm.
EA has deep pockets. It survived about 3 years of poor stock performance. It rebounded nicely, although a lot of their current business practices are questionable at best, at least questionable by me and my standards. But still, they're one of the top AAA companies out there.
Mm-hmm.
So I expect Andromeda will do fine.
Well, and I think that EA kind of, at least for the most part, learned their lesson in terms of like how they've conducted themselves with Dragon Age and Mass Effect, because they were voted the worst company in America for, I think it was 2 years in a row, following Mass Effect 3's release and the outrage of Mass Effect 3's ending. And then you got a lot of fan pressure to extend Dragon Age Inquisition so that they didn't rush it again, like they did Dragon Age 2. And, with Dragon Age Inquisition, after being pushed away from rushing that game, Dragon Age Inquisition actually went on to win several Game of the Year titles. So I want to believe, like, the positive side of me really wants to believe that EA has learned their lesson on this. So, I'm not inclined to believe that the people that are leaving are a result of EA, especially when you take into consideration that there are writers like Drew who initially left BioWare for their own personal projects and then came back for Andromeda. And, Guider has been working at BioWare for around a decade. And, he got his start working on D&D games like Neverwinter Nights and Baldur's Gate and things like that. And he's going back to work on games like that. So, it's not understandable that he'd want to go back to, where he started. And then you got other people that are going back home and might actually be starting personal projects or going to other companies as well.
I mean, yeah, you see a lot of cross-employment in the industry. People jump jobs back and forth, etc.
Mm-hmm.
We might have to talk about how, in fact, games are put together, especially from the design point of view, and some of the criticisms of how video games are made, but not today.
No, that's a whole other can of worms.
Exactly. Exactly. To quote another podcast, we're going to have to can of worms that topic. But one more thing, I think it's perhaps in the long term, and this is going back to Mass Effect, that while any one game can be a success, and clearly Dragon Age Inquisition was a success, Mass Effect 3, in spite of all the criticism, was a huge success for them. You also have the idea of keeping the IP alive. And what can happen is that over time, you have the erosion of the consumer base, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people that bought your game today might say, well, that other game doesn't sound as great as the last one, so maybe I'm going to delay buying it, or even not buy it at all, or buy it on sale. The modern, AAA companies rely a lot on microtransactions. They rely on pre-orders as well in order to maintain their financials, right? Games are very expensive, so if a lot of people pre-order, they can put that in their books as sales. Keeping games in the hands of players as long as possible also means that they're likely to buy microtransactions and DLC, which of course means more profits. The long-term health of any IP depends on maintaining a healthy and perhaps growing consumer base. Not simply a fan base, but a consumer base. And we'll have to see if Andromeda, it stands on its own 2 feet and in fact inspires people to keep buying Mass Effect products. Because if they do,
Right.
the IP will be healthy. If it's part of a long-term erosion of the IP, then we can talk about not Andromeda, but the IP and probably eventually BioWare being in trouble. Because there's another thing about Electronic Arts. They do have a reputation for closing down and literally gobbling up studios left and right. Like some of the best studios that the American market has produced, your Bullfrogs, your Origins, fell under the sway of Electronic Arts and are never to be seen again. So I think for people like me who have been around for quite some time, that's always something that we have to consider. It does not mean that Andromeda is going to be a complete disaster. I'm not saying that. I understand the concerns, but my advice is always wait and see. When you get the product in your hands, you play it, you evaluate it, and then you move on.
Well, there are people that think that the game is going to get canceled because of everything that's been going on.
No, I don't think so. At this stage of the game, I don't think they're gonna cancel it.
Not when
It's
they
just-
put this much work into it. Not when they're this close to release. I don't think it's going to get canceled this close.
I don't think we're gonna get what happened with Fable Legends, where literally and what happened with Fable Legends and Microsoft Studios used to be Microsoft Games.
Oh yeah,
is
they got
literally
they closed down.
they closed down the studio. So if it's you're gonna hear more about closing down BioWare first than any one game getting canceled. It has happened before. There was a first-person shooter program for Mass Effect, and that never saw the light of day. Although an iOS first-person shooter for Mass Effect did come out, wasn't that successful, but it's out there, and that got canceled. But it got canceled relatively early in its development.
Mm-hmm.
We're very much halfway, if not past the halfway mark when it comes to this. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars. You don't throw that kind of money around if you're not willing to commit to finishing the project.
Right, exactly. And it's not like, well, in terms of like, as I mentioned before, like the people that have been leaving are all like writers. Their job on Andromeda is done. So, they don't have to worry about replacing those people right away. The only person they really had to worry about replacing was Chris Wynn. And as far as I'm aware, they likely already had him replaced because it's been about a month since he left. And a couple of the people that left telling fans the game is going to blow you away. Don't worry.
Well, again, wait and see. That's the best advice that we can give them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's all for us. Gludipow, thank you as always for joining us. And as always, if you like this or any video or podcast on Lessons Learned channel, please comment and subscribe, and I'll see you when I see you. Good night.
Bye-bye.